Rilke, Ranier Maria Rilke, is a German poet who figures importantly in sort of the middle period of existentialism. He also wrote one novel over the course of his lifetime, and that's what we're going to look at today, the notebooks of Malte Laurids Brigge. And there's a lot of interesting themes that come up within Rilke's poetry over and over again surfacing in this novel. And it's also a good lens through which to look at the poetry. So that's why I'm actually beginning with this first. And then we'll look at Letters to a Young Poet, and then we'll finally get into the poetry as such. And there's certain key themes of the novel that are going to keep arising over and over again. And again, run throughout the whole of Rilke's life and work. Writing itself, the function of the, in this case, novelist or the journalist, also the function of the poet himself or herself. Existence. What is it to exist? What is it to be in the world? What is it to exist among other people within an environment? What he calls things with a capital T, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. The emotions, Rilke is somebody who's very good at depicting, oftentimes with just a word or two, the play of emotions within a person or even within a thing, within a situation. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail later. What I would like to say is Rilke is definitely somebody who has experienced a wide variety of emotions himself. Childhood and adulthood, again, themes that are very common in his poetry. A lot of his poetry is retrospective, looking back to either his childhood or somebody else's childhood, sometimes an imagined one. Death, what it is to die, what it is for other people to die, what death itself is, whether we ought to fear it or embrace it, that's going to be a key theme. Time itself, time understood both in terms of the succession, the passing of time, and also in terms of epochs, of the age that we're in. Is the modern age fundamentally different from the ages before it? And is there value to be found at each moment, or does value only arise within certain cultural, historical situations? And then finally, one other really central theme, love. And you might say, well, that fits in with emotions, but love is dealt with in a somewhat different way by Rilke. There is one other theme that I didn't put on the board that I perhaps probably should, because it runs through all of these. And Rilke has a very ambiguous relation to this other key theme, and that would be, in fact, God. Rilke is a religious poet. He's deeply imbued with a sense of the sacred, not only in its presence, but also in its loss. And in a very idiosyncratic way. He'll talk a little bit about religion and about God. He'll talk actually more about God than religion in these notebooks, and also in his poetry. You get a very profound sense of a rootedness, of him trying to come to grips with the God of his childhood, the God that he would like to find out there. But in a very non-dogmatic, it's committed, but not committed in the sense of committed to a particular view on God or religion. God is something that you quest for Rilke, not something that you say that you've got a hold of and that you can necessarily transmit to others. So these are some key themes. I'd like to begin by just mentioning or reading a few of the central passages that help you get an idea of what Rilke's up to in this and also in his other writings. And I'm actually going to be doing a lot of reading from Rilke's novel in this, with maybe not as much commentary as I usually give during these lectures. So, because his writing is so beautiful. So he says this. He's talking about his own writing, his own poetry. And this is a fictional character, but this is also Rilke. He says, I sit here in my little room, I, Brigge, who am 28 years old and completely unknown. I sit here and am nothing. And yet this nothing begins to think, and thinks 5 flights up on a gray Paris afternoon, these thoughts. Now before I read these thoughts, I would like just to mention this. What this reminds me of more than anything else is a passage by Blaise Pascal, where he talks about man as a thinking reed, as this nothing that thinks. Pascal is thinking in these terms as well. And it's not for nothing that Pascal is often viewed as being an existentialist before the movement of existentialism. I think Rilke is attuned to something very much like that. So, I'm nobody, I'm nothing, and yet I'm going to think. What are the thoughts? Here's the thoughts. Is it possible, it thinks, that we have not yet seen, known, or said anything real and important? Is it possible that we've had thousands of years to look, meditate, and record, and that we have let these thousands of years slip away like a recess at school when there is just enough time to eat your sandwich and an apple? Yes, it's possible. Is it possible that despite our discoveries and advances, despite our culture, religion, and science, we have remained on the surface of life? Is it possible that even this surface, which might have been something, has been covered with an incredibly tedious material which makes it look like the living room furniture during the summer vacation? Yes, it's possible. So let me pause right there. At this point, we're dealing with stuff that seems, like fairly typical adolescent. My time is the time that, is going to break through, and I'm going to, finally unveil existence as it is. Everybody else has been missing out so far. Is that all there is, though? Is it possible that the whole history of the world has been misunderstood? Is it possible that the past is false because we've always spoken about its masses, just as if we were telling about a gathering of many people instead of talking about the one person they were standing around because he was a stranger and was dying? Now, we're starting to see some historical depth. The question is, what should we be paying attention to? Is it just whatever many people are looking to, or what the many people are preoccupied with, or is it the thing that actually gives them some focus, or the person who gives them some focus? Is it possible that we had thought to retrieve what happened before we were born? Is it possible that every one of us would have to be reminded that he had his origin in all who have gone before, that consequently he contains this past and has nothing to learn from those who assert their knowledge is greater? Yes, it is possible. Is it possible that all these people know with perfect accuracy a past that never existed? Is it possible that all realities are nothing to them, that their life is running down unconnected with anything like a clock in an empty room? Yes, it is possible. Is it possible that we know nothing about young girls who are nevertheless living? Is it possible that we say women, children, boys, not suspecting, despite all our culture not suspecting, that these words have long since had no plural but only countless singulars? Yes, it is possible. We're getting further and further into a deep metaphysics here. We use these words to make sense out of the environment that we're in. But existence is always singular, is always particular, is always personal. We can speak of women, children, men. He'll talk about this in one of his poems later on. But really, there's only the singular ones. And we try to group them together into categories. And then we think about those abstract concepts. But really, what we're encountering are this man, this child, this woman, at this time. That's what has value. Now he says, is it possible that there are people who say God and think that this is something they have in common? Take a couple of schoolboys. One buys a pocket knife, and the same day his friend buys another exactly like it. After a week, they compare knives, and it turns out that there's now just a very distant resemblance between them. So differently have they developed in different hands. Oh, says the mother of one, you can't own anything without wearing it out in a day. In the same way, is it possible to believe we could have a God without using him? That's very interesting, isn't it? Our notion of God, when people use this word, is it like a count word, like man, woman, child? Is it a concept word? Or in order to be something that really matters, does it have to be an experienced and mysterious reality? And if God really exists, and if God is, infinite, is my grasp on God going to resemble your grasp on God? Should we pretend that those are exactly the same, that these concepts that we have map onto each other, and that if I don't have the same concept as you do, or you don't have the same concept as I do, we don't have the same as somebody else, or some group, that we are misgrasping God? That's, something worth thinking about that Rilke is suggesting here. And like a pocket knife, or, here's another example. I'm very hard on things, as not only my wife, but many other people have pointed out to me in time. Here's a wallet, and originally this wallet looked pretty much, I'm willing to guess, like all the other wallets that it came with. And now it's got certain colorations, certain scratches, certain wear patterns to it. Wouldn't God be like that? I mean, people become like that. We wear upon each other. We change each other in the process. Well, God would be like that as well. If you say the Psalms and you understand God through saying the Psalter every day and meditating on that, actually there's something in the Psalter like that. The man who meditates on the law of God day and night, that's the very first psalm, it discusses that. Him being like a tree planted near running waters, his roots go down deep below, and he always has water even when it gets dry. Isn't that very different than a sort of abstract concept of, well, God is something over there, started the universe? Isn't that very different than somebody who practices seeing God in the face of the other person day after day after day? Well, that's something that Rilke is having a sort of intimate experience with. He goes on, if all this is possible, if it has even a semblance of possibility, then surely for the sake of everything in the world, something must be done. So writing is actually a call to action on his part. It seems like, a strange thing. The writer is somebody who's removing him or herself from reality and then maybe copying it. But this is an intervention within reality. For the sake of everything in the world, something must be done. The first comer, the one who had these alarming thoughts, must begin to do some of the things that have been neglected. Even though he is just anyone, certainly not the most suitable person, since there's no one else. This young, insignificant foreigner, Brigge, will have to sit down in his room 5 flights up and keep writing day and night. Yes, he will have to write. That is how it will end. So, Rilke is really, this is a very interesting self-reflective passage. He's not the most suitable person. It's never the most suitable person who's placed in the position of doing anything that matters, is it? I mean, or rarely. Those who become saints, they, tell you, this really wasn't my job or my destiny, but I took it on because I was the only person who could do it at the time, and I'm not really happy with the job that I did with it, but there you go. And it's that way with great philosophers, it's that way with great teachers, it's that way with great writers. He says something else about writing too. This is a little bit earlier. He's talking about poetry. And he says, and this goes for the writer as well, poems amount to so little when you write them too early in your life. You ought to wait and gather sense and sweetness for a whole lifetime, and a long one if possible, and then at the very end you might be able to write 10 good lines. For poems are not, as people think, simply emotions. One has emotions early enough. That's his parenthetical comment there. They are experiences. Before I go on with this, so what he's saying is something, in effect, similar to what Aristotle is saying in the Nicomachean Ethics when he says, you know, you shouldn't teach ethics to kids who are only 18 years old because they have all these, emotions, and they have a hard time keeping those emotions themselves in track, and emotions aren't enough to go on for ethics. What you need is some actual life experience. And by that he doesn't mean having experiences in the sense of having done something or seen something or something like that. He means having meditated upon it, having thought about it, having brought the experiences together and formed concepts about them. Rilke is actually saying something very similar to that. Now, I'm not saying actually that Aristotle's right about this, or that Rilke is necessarily right about this either. But I'm saying that they are talking about the same type of thing. One in terms of moral philosophy, one in terms of artistic production. So let's go on and see what he has to say about this. For the sake of a single poem, you must see many cities, many people, and things. You must understand animals, must feel how birds fly, and know the gestures which small flowers make when they open them in the morning. You must be able to think back to streets in unknown neighborhoods, to unexpected encounters, and to partings you had long seen coming, to days of childhood whose mystery is still unexplained, to parents whom you had to hurt when they brought in a joy and you didn't pick it up, because it was a joy meant for someone else. To childhood illnesses that began so strangely with so many profound and difficult transformations, to days in quiet, restrained rooms, and to mornings by the sea, to the sea itself, to seas, to nights of travel that rushed along high overhead and went flying with all the stars. And it is still not enough to be able to think of all that. That's already a lot, isn't it? We'll come back to that in a moment. You must have memories of many nights of love, each one different from all the others. Memories of women screaming in labor and of light, pale, sleeping girls who have just given birth and are closing again. But you must also have been beside the dying, must have sat beside the dead in the room with the open window and the scattered noises. And it is not yet enough to have memories. You must be able to forget them when they are many, and you must have the immense patience to wait until they return. For the memories themselves are not important. Only when they have changed into our very blood, into glance and gesture, and are nameless, no longer to be distinguished from ourselves. Only then can it happen that in some very rare hour, the first word of a poem arises in their midst and goes forth from them. So, beautiful passage, right? And again, Rilke is a poet, so he has his ways with words. What is he saying is necessary here to do the kind of writing that will generate genuine, real, transcendent, authentic poetry? How do we get to our end product over here? Well, you do need emotion. Oops, there we go. So, and you have to have many experiences. Is that enough? Well, now he's not spelling everything out for you here. And I'm not going to linger over every single passage of the book like I am here, but I think this is very important to work our way through. You ought to wait and gather sense and sweetness for a whole lifetime, and a long one if possible. So, what else is needed? Time. And you have to generate these into memories. And then you have to forget them. And then they have to become part of your very being, the fabric of who you are, right? So we have two vectors here. Time has to turn the many experiences, the emotions, into memories. Then you have to forget them long enough for them to become part of the very fabric of your being. Like he says, the memories themselves are not important, only when they have changed into our very blood, into glance and gesture, and are nameless. Then, in the rare hour, the first word of the poem arises in their midst and goes forth from them. So, all of this is important, and many experiences of all sorts of types, right? Many emotions of all sorts of types. What is the precondition for this to happen? Two things. One of which you have control over, and one of which you don't have control over. Now, if you actually want to if you want to see many cities, many people and things, understand animals, feel how birds fly, know the gesture which small flowers make when they open in the morning, all those sorts of things. And you don't necessarily have to have those things, right? You could have other things substituting for that as well. What that reminds me of is the scene in the Blade Runner, actually, where Rutger Hauer's character is describing having seen, fire ships off of, and I forget exactly, the moon that they're engaging in battle over. And it's a wonderful sight. You actually have to have not only experiences, but you have to have openness. You have to pay attention. And you have to give something. You have to give time. It's not enough to let time pass. You actually have to give time to these things. You can't see how a flower opens unless you're actually coming back to it day after day after day. Take crocuses, for example, the very first flowers of spring, at least in the Midwest where I grew up. You plant them the season before in fall. They're there in the entire winter. While there's still snow on the ground, the first crocuses start shooting their shoots up, and then you see a tiny little flash of color, yellow or white or blue or purple. And then they're the first ones to actually unfold themselves. You actually have to stop and pay attention to what's going on and look at those and care about that and value seeing those flowers in relation to all the other things that are going on in your life, or you're going to miss it. And then after you miss the crocuses, then you'll miss the daffodils and the hyacinths and the tulips, and it keeps going on and on and on. What else do you need? Well, like he says, you have to gather all these things to yourself. Only then can it happen that in some very rare hour, something fortuitous has to happen. Something has to occur. Some liberation has to take place. You can't make poetry just by doing all of this. This is all necessary conditions for it. There has to be some fortuitous coming together of things that awakens those memories and now gets you ready. So that's what Rilke thinks that poetry is really about. And is that what is going on here? Yeah, in a sense. What else is going on, though? He describes this a little bit later on when he's talking about the process of writing as well. So he says, he has an experience. He decided that in similar cases he would go straight to the facts. I noticed how simple they were and what a relief as opposed to conjectures, as if I hadn't known that all our insights are added on later, that they are balance sheets, nothing more. Right afterward, a new page begins with a completely different account and no total carried forward. What help in the present case with a few facts which it was child's play to establish? He's writing, and that's part of what's going on in this novel. If you're reading it for the first time, it may be a bit disconcerting until you start seeing some of the common threads tying together, because he seems to be jumping from one thing to another. The narrative is not remaining constant. It's not in a great, sequence. You could actually take parts of it and put them earlier and parts of it and put them later, and it wouldn't necessarily alter the work in any major sense. He's jumping through time back to his childhood, or actually the childhood of the narrator. He's jumping backwards even further in time, you know, talking about what this poet was doing, or this Portuguese nun, or you know, this king. So what's actually going on there? These are like balance sheets, each one a separate thing. Not necessarily having the organic totality of a great poem. Let's go on now to the next important theme, existence. Like I said before, he's casting himself in a very Pascalian sense as a nothing, but a nothing who thinks, who experiences. And what is he thinking about? The meaning of, not necessarily the meaning of life as such, but the meaning of things, the meaning of persons, the meaning of experiences. He's not just recording them, he's delving into them, he's reflecting on them, he's trying to bring out into some sort of verbalization what it is that these things mean, what they are in their heart. He talks about the experience in Paris as having changed him. And there's a nice passage where he actually brings up another poet, not that far removed from him in time, Baudelaire. He says, I'm in Paris. People who hear this are glad. Most of them envy me. They're right. It is a great city, great and filled with strange temptations. For myself, I must admit that I have, in a certain sense, succumbed to them. I don't think there's any other way to express it. I succumbed to these temptations. This has brought about certain changes. If not in my character, at least in my point of view, and in any case, in my life. An entirely different conception of all things has developed in me under these influences. I've had certain experiences that separate me from other people. More than anything I have ever felt in the past. I'm going to read that one line again. I've had certain experiences that separate me from other people more than anything I've ever felt in the past. A different world. A new world filled with new meanings. For the moment I am finding it a bit difficult because everything is too new. I am a beginner in my own life. So these temptations, they're not just temptations to go out and have a good time, you know, try new liquors that you haven't had before, have love affairs, or, you know, find some, you know, weird thing that you can get into that only, you know, a great city like Paris or New York or something like that could offer you. This has to do with the meaning of his own life. Who is he? What is his existence about? And he says, do you remember Baudelaire's incredible poem, Un Charron, which is actually translated as, you know, like a carrion. We'd actually call it a roadkill. Perhaps I understand it now. Except for the last stanza, he was in the right. What would he have done after that happened to him? It was his task to see in this terrifying and apparently repulsive object, because that's what the poem is about. It's about roadkill and what's going on and how the maggots are, you know, writhing around in it. Baudelaire is able to find beauty in it. Rilke finds metaphysics in it. The being that underlies all individual beings. There is no choice, no refusal. Do you think it was by chance that Flaubert wrote his Saint Julien, L'Hospitalière? This, it seems to me, is the test whether you can bring yourself to lie beside a leper and warm him with the warmth of your own heart. Such an action could only have good results. But don't think I'm suffering from disenchantment here. On the contrary. One of the common problems that you see in the modern world, and a lot of people have written about this, they call it the age of disenchantment. As if modernity means stripping away all the previous superstition and fairy world and, you know, all this childish nonsense that people were having before, and leaving us with a world that's stark, cold, absurd, not connected with our desires, our wishes. It can't correspond to our heart, to what it is that we most deeply desire. That's the way a lot of existentialists represent the reality, isn't it? That's the way Sartre represents it, and Camus, and other people like that. That's not the way that Rilke represents it. The world is mysterious, but the world offers us a kind of intimacy that does correspond ultimately to some of our deepest desires. He says, "Don't think I'm suffering from disenchantment. On the contrary, I'm sometimes astonished by how readily I've given up everything I expected in exchange for what is real, even when that is awful." So that's what he's talking about when he's referring to Baudelaire's poem about the carrion, the roadkill. And then he goes on a little bit further and he says, "My God, if only something of this could be shared. But what would it be then? What would it be? No, it is only at the price of solitude." So that's the fundamental question for Rilke in this work. We get to know existence. We get to know being itself. Can we communicate it? Can we actually share it with another being? And not communicate it just in the sense of talking about it or writing about it, but actually have community, share it in the sense of partaking in it together. Is that a possibility for us? So we're going to see that as we go on, and I'm actually going to skip over some of the other themes. I'm going to skip over his discussion of things, with a capital T. I'm actually going to skip over some of the discussions that he has of the various emotions. I'm actually going to jump far ahead into one of the things that happens in his childhood, and it has to do with love and reading. There's a long passage where he is recollecting. And I'll just read this and make a few interjections here and there. He says, "It became obvious to me I was never a real reader. As a child, I thought that reading was a profession which would have to be taken on at some future time, when all the professions came around, one by one, for consideration." And this is, very typical sort of child view of things. Rilke's metaphysics is imbued with a kind of fantasy that childhood things have, that introduces a kind of on-the-spot Platonism, we'll call it, where anything can become real, concepts, objects, and they not only can become real, they can become personal. They can take on personal characteristics, emotions, intentions. So the professions would come around one by one for consideration. To tell the truth, I didn't have a clear idea of when that would be. I believed that I would be able to tell when life turned around, as it were, and came only from outside, as it had until then come from inside. I imagined it would become intelligible and unambiguous and never liable to misunderstanding. And this is a child's view of adult life, isn't it? That somehow all of this is going to clear up, and the mysterious stuff will become clear as day. Not simple by any means, on the contrary, very exacting, intricate and difficult perhaps, but always visible. Childhood's strangely unbounded world, its unconditionality and elusiveness, would then have been surmounted, though of course I didn't know how. In reality, that world kept increasing, closing together on all sides, and the more I looked outside, the more I stirred up what was inside me. God knows where it came from, but probably it grew to its utmost limits and then suddenly broke off. It was easy to observe that grown-ups were hardly disturbed by it at all. They went around judging and doing, and if they ever got into difficulties, they blamed that on external circumstances. So very interesting meditations on childhood and what it means to mature. And he says, so I postponed reading along with other such matters until the beginning of these changes, until my world started to, I thought it would become very clear and unambiguous, and it actually got more complicated. Then I would act towards books as I acted towards friends. There would be time for them, a definite time that would pass regularly and pleasantly, just as much of it as I felt like. Naturally, certain of them would be closer to me than others. And this is not to say I would be certain of not wasting half an hour over them every once in a while, when I might have been enjoying a walk, a conversation, the first act of a play, or an urgent letter. But that a person's hair could get mussed up and tangled as if he'd been lying on it, that his ears could grow flaming red and his hands felt as cold as metal, that the long candle beside him could burn down right to the candlestick, all this was, thank God, not within the realm of possibility. And then he says, I mention these symptoms because I myself experienced them quite vividly during the vacation at Ulsgaard when I so suddenly discovered reading. It became immediately obvious I didn't know how. I, of course, had begun my reading before the future time I'd assigned to it. So he begins to have experiences with reading, and you might say the bug catches him. And I'm going to skip over a little bit. He starts talking about, finding new worlds within the books, and that the books would break off a piece of the world. He says, before books came, it was whole, and perhaps it would be again that way afterward. But how could I, who didn't know how to read, cope with them all? There they stood even in the modest library in such hopeless abundance and solidarity. I plunged from book to book and fought through the pages like someone who has to perform a task beyond his strength. At that time I read Schiller and Baggesen, and it goes on and on and on. In later years, it occasionally happened. I woke up at night and the stars stood out with such reality and moved forward so meaningfully, and I couldn't understand how people managed to miss such a world. Notice, he's not talking about reading there. He's talking about, again, these sort of experiences that you have to have if you want to do something like poetry. I had a similar feeling, I think, whenever I looked up from the books and glanced outside, where the summer was, where Abelone was calling me. It seemed quite surprising to us that she had to call and that I didn't even answer. This was in the midst of our happiest time. But since the fever had now taken hold of me, I obsessively clung to my reading and hid, self-important and obstinate, from our daily holidays. Abelone is a woman who is clearly older than him and related to him in some sort of way, and with whom he has or experiences love. And then he says, my reader's trance ended one day as suddenly as it had begun. And then we made each other thoroughly angry. For Abelone didn't spare me any kind of ridicule or condescension, and when I met her in the arbor, she would declare she was reading, to sort of spite him. And then he starts talking about their relationship. And now we start shifting to the theme of love itself. At least you could read out loud, bookworm, she says to him. This didn't sound very hostile at all, and so he started to read aloud, and then he starts reading about another person, Bettina. And this is a person who's writing letters about her own love. And so we're going to look now at the theme of love. And after that, we'll look at death, and then we'll talk once more as we end about love. So Rilke writes quite a bit in here about different women. Some of it is through recollection, and some of it is through kind of speculation. And there's two characters that stand out in particular. One is the one we've already mentioned, Abelone, and I'm going to read a little bit more about her, and then we'll talk about this Bettina character. And then we'll talk about love itself and the girls in the city. So, what do we know about this first character? He says, it was in the year after his mother's death that he first noticed her. She was always there. And, like he says, all at once I asked myself, why is she there? Each of us had a reason for being there, even if it wasn't always as obvious as, for example, the utility of Sophie Ox. But why was she there? For a short time, people used to say she needed a little entertainment. That was quickly forgotten. No one contributed anything to it, and she didn't give you the impression she was entertained. She had one good quality: she sang, and that means there were times that she sang. And so at first our relationship consisted in her telling me stories about when Mama was a girl. She wanted very much to convince me how brave and youthful Mama had been. And so she's telling these stories. And then he says, I was curious to know why Abelone had not gotten married. She seemed relatively old, and it never occurred to me she might still be able to. There just wasn't anyone, she answered simply. And as she said these words, she became truly beautiful. Is she beautiful? I asked myself, surprised. Then I left home to go to the Academy for the Young Noblemen, and an odious and painful period of my life began. But there at Sorrow, when I stood at a window apart from the others and they left me in peace for a while, I would look out of the trees, and in such moments and at night the certainty grew in me that she was beautiful. And I began to write her all those letters, long ones and short ones, many secret letters in which I thought I was talking about Ulsgaard and my unhappiness. But as I can see now, they must really have been love letters. So this is important. You know, having the experiences is not just a matter of going around and looking at things. It is a matter of learning one's emotions. And one's emotions quite oftentimes come upon one before one even realizes what's going on. And he says, when summer vacation finally came, though at first it seemed it never would, it was as if by prearrangement that we didn't meet in the presence of the others. And then he says, I will never forget how you looked at me then, how you wore your look holding it up on your back-tilted face like something that could never be changed. And so this goes on in bits and pieces here and there. Let's look also at this character Bettina, who's a character that they're both talking about. And he says, this strange Bettina created space with all her letters, a world of vastly enlarged dimensions. She's generating poetry. She's generating poetry through not trying to write poems, but through writing love letters. From the beginning, she spread herself out through everything as if she had already passed beyond her death. Everywhere she deeply entered into existence, became part of it, and whatever happened to her had from all eternity been contained in nature. In it she recognized herself, and she detached herself from it almost painfully, laboriously, guessed herself back, as if out of the past, conjured herself like a ghost and endured it. And then a little bit later he says, he's addressing her, your love was equal to everything. How is it possible that everyone isn't still telling of your love? What has happened since then that is more important? What are they concerned with? You yourself knew the value of your love. You said it aloud to your greatest poet so that he would make it human, for it was still elemental. But in writing to you, he dissuaded people from believing it. He goes on and he's talking about love itself. And he says, fate loves to invent designs and patterns. Its difficulty lies in complexity. But life itself is difficult because of its simplicity. It has just a few elements of a grandeur we can never fathom. The fact that woman, in accordance with her nature, must make the same choice in relation to man, this is what calls forth the doomed quality of all love relationships. Resolute and fateless like an eternal being, she stands beside the one who is transformed. The woman who loves always surpasses the man she loves, because life is larger than fate. Her self-surrender wants to be infinite. This is her happiness. But the nameless suffering of her love has always been that she is required to limit this self-surrender. A lot going on there. And Rilke is primarily thinking of this in terms of, you know, women and men having different roles, but I think that you can actually see something very similar going on in both sides of the relationship. It just depends on who is actually doing the loving. This will come clear as we look at the issue of the prodigal son a little bit later. He says, there's no other lament that has ever been lamented by women. The first two letters of Eloise contain only this. Eloise writing to Abelard. And the first 500 years later, it rises from the letters of the Portuguese nun. It is as recognizable as a bird call. And he talks about this coming up with other women in other places as well. He's got this passage about the girls in the city who go to the big city. Again, this is Paris. And he says, here we go. Occasionally you do find young girls in front of these paintings. There are a lot of young girls in the museums who have here or there left their houses, who no longer keep anything. They find themselves in front of these tapestries and forget themselves for a while. He says, the main thing is just to keep drawing, for that is the reason they left home one day rather violently. They come from good families. But when they lift their arms as they draw, it appears that their dress isn't buttoned in back, or at least not completely. There's a few buttons they couldn't reach. For the way when the dress was made, no one had imagined they would suddenly go away alone. Unless you have a friend who's going to bother with that. Inevitably, you sometimes wonder as you draw whether it wouldn't have been possible to stay home after all. If only you could have been religious, sincerely religious, in tune with the others. But it seems so absurd to try doing that in common. And then he goes on a little bit further. In their intense absorption within their work, these young girls no longer even think of looking up. They don't notice how in everything they draw they are merely suppressing inside themselves the unalterable life that in these woven pictures is radiantly open in front of them, infinite and unsayable. They don't want to believe it. Now that so much is changing, they too want to change. They are on the verge of abandoning themselves and thinking about themselves as men might speak of them when they aren't there. This to them seems like progress. They are already almost convinced that you search out one pleasure and then another and then even a stronger one, that life consists in this. You don't want to stupidly lose it. They've already begun to look around to search they whose strength always consisted in being found. That comes, Rilke says, I think from their tiredness. Over their centuries, they've taken onto themselves the entire task of love. They've played the entire dialogue, both parts. For man has only repeated their words and done it badly. This is Rilke's view of love up until this point, that it's primarily women who are structuring all of this. Despite that, they have persevered day and night and have increased in love and misery. And from among them, under the pressure of endless sorrows, those powerful examples of women in love have come forth, who even as, while they called him, surpassed the man they loved, who grew above him and beyond him when he didn't return. Like Gaspara Stampa, or the Portuguese nun who didn't cease until the torment suddenly turned into a bitter, icy magnificence, which nothing could confuse. We know about these women because there are letters that have, as if by a miracle, been preserved, or books of poems. And he goes on, there have been innumerably more of them, those who burned their letters and others who no longer had the strength to write them. And he talks about all these different ways in which love, in the way that he's describing it, as something very powerful, conceals itself in founders and loses itself. But really what he's describing here is something very similar to poetry. Poetry carried out in life. Now he asks this thing, and he says, now that so much is changing, isn't it time for us to change? Couldn't we try to gradually develop and slowly take upon ourselves, little by little, our part in the great task of love? We've been spared all its trouble, and that's why it has slipped in among our distractions, as a piece of real lace will sometimes fall into a child's toy box. We have been spoiled by superficial pleasures like dilettantes, and are looked upon as masters. What if we despised our successes? What if we started from the very outset to learn the task of love, which has always been done for us? What if we went ahead and became beginners, now that much is changing? And that is really what the book, well, it's one of the things that the book is about. What is it to love? Is love greater than death? Is love something that reveals to us existence in a way that's not, sort of putting rose-colored glasses on and pretending that things are, better than they are? It's not a filter keeping reality from us. It's rather a lens or an opening showing us reality as it truly is. And so I'm not going to have the time actually to talk about death itself. There is actually, no, actually I'll talk about one thing. He talks about a modern view on death and an older view on death. One impersonal, one personal, and how it has to do with beauty and how it could have to do with love. So I will talk about that, but then I want to get to the prodigal son and bring this to a good end. He talks about places where people die in the modern world, and that they're not very concerned with the death that they get. And that death is almost manufactured for them. He says, you come, you find a life ready-made, you just have to slip it on. You leave when you want to or when you're forced to. Anyway, no effort. Voilà votre mort, monsieur. You die as best you can. You die the death that belongs to the sickness that you have. For all sicknesses are well known. It's also known that the fatal endings belong to the sicknesses and not to the people. And the sick person has, so to speak, nothing more to do. And so you get a death. But it's not really yours. It's just sort of a thing that gets appended to you. And then he says, when I think back to my home, things were different back then. Then you knew that you had your death inside you as a fruit has its core. The children had a small one in them and the grown-ups a large one. The women had it in their womb and the men in their chest. You had it. And that gave you a strange dignity and a quiet pride. And then he talks about his grandfather and about Christopher Detlev Brigge. But he talks also about, here we go, when I think about the others I've seen or heard of, it's always the same. They had a death of their own. Those men who carried it in their armor inside themselves like a prisoner. Those women who grew very old and small and then on an enormous bed, as if on the stage of a theater in front of the whole family and the assembled servants and dogs, discreetly and with the greatest dignity passed away. The children too, even the very small ones, didn't have any child's death. They gathered themselves and died what they already were and what they would have become. And what a melancholy beauty this gave to women when they were pregnant and stood there, with their slender hands instinctively resting on their large bellies in which there were two fruits, a child and a death. Didn't the dense, almost nourishing smile on their emptied faces come from their sometimes feeling that both were growing inside them? So the idea is that within life, we are attached enough to it that there's something for us, even in our death. There's a meaning to it, an appropriateness to it. As opposed to the sort of modern world in which everything is no longer singular, is personal, it's all very impersonal, just things fitting into a concept, and you get the death that fits you, just like something off the rack, and if it fits, good, if it doesn't, that's just the way it is. Let's look now at how he ends the book, with the story of the prodigal son. And he's reworking this old gospel story into something quite new. He says, "It would be difficult to persuade me that the story of the prodigal son is not the legend of a man who didn't want to be loved. When he was a child, everyone in the house loved him. He grew up not knowing it could be any other way, and got used to their tenderness when he was a child. But as a boy, he tried to lay aside these habits. He wouldn't have been able to say it, but when he spent the whole day roaming around outside and didn't even want to have the dogs with him, it was because they too loved him, because in their eyes he could see observation and sympathy, expectation, concern. Because in their presence he couldn't do anything without giving pleasure or pain. But what he wanted in those days was that profound indifference of heart, which sometimes early in the morning, in the fields, seized him with such purity he had to start running, in order to have no time or breath to be more than a weightless moment in which the morning becomes conscious of itself." So, there can be a sheltered existence in which one feels as if one is lacking reality, missing out on something that's there. And so that is what he thinks the prodigal son leaves behind. The secret of that life of his, which had never yet come into being, spread out before him. So he goes away. And then he says, "My God, how much there was then to leave behind and forget. For you really had to forget. Otherwise you would betray yourself when they insisted." And skipping ahead a little bit, he says, "It's useless for such a person to walk up to the front steps with infinite caution. They will all be in the living room, and as soon as the door opens, they will all look his way. He remains in the dark, wants to wait for their questions. But then comes the worst. They take him by the hands, lead him over to the table, and all of them, as many as are there, gather inquisitively in front of the lamp. They have the best of it. They stay in the shadows, and on him alone falls, along with the light, all the shame of having a face. Can he stay and conform to this lying life of approximations which they've assigned to him? Can he divide himself between the delicate truthfulness of his will and the coarse deceit which corrupts it in his own eyes? No, he will go away. For example, while they're all busy setting out his birthday table, those badly guessed presents which once again are supposed to make up for everything, he will go away forever. Not until long afterward would he realize how thoroughly he had decided never to love, in order not to put anyone in the terrible position of being loved. Love, for Rilke, is not something that, just gets you in trouble if you love somebody else and they don't love you back. It imposes demands on the beloved, on the one who's cared for. And he says, he remembered this years later, and like other good intentions, it too had proved impossible. For he had loved again and again in his solitude, each time squandering his whole nature and in unspeakable fear for the freedom of the other person. Slowly he had learned to let the rays of his emotion shine through into the beloved object, instead of consuming the emotion in her. And he was pampered by the joy of recognizing, through the more and more transparent form of the beloved, the expanses that she opened to his infinite desire for possession. So, I'm going to skip on a little bit further. He's unable to keep himself from loving, and that's probably a good thing. And when you love, you have to seek objects for your love. That's the nature of love. It has to become concrete, and it has to change reality and make it greater. He says, later on, this is the time which began with his feeling as general and anonymous as a slowly recovering convalescent. He didn't love anything unless it could be said that he loved existing. The humble love that he felt for his sheep, felt for him, was no burden, like sunlight falling through clouds. Strangers saw him on the Acropolis, and perhaps for many years he was one of the shepherds in Lambeau, and saw petrified time outlast that noble family, which in spite of all their conquests, under the holy numbers 7 and 3, could not overcome the fatal 16-rayed start on their own coat of arms. Or should I imagine him at the Orange, and he goes on further with this. He says, it doesn't matter. I see more than him. I see his whole existence, which was then beginning its long love towards God. That silent work undertaken without thought of ever reaching its goal. For though he had wanted to hold himself back forever, he was now once again overcome by the growing urgency of his heart. Love needs to come out. And it will come out in all different ways, and it will orient itself towards all sorts of things. The question is what it will orient itself towards, what shape it will take, what direction. And he says, at this time he hoped to be answered. His whole being, which during his long solitude had become prescient and imperturbable, promised him that the one he was now turning to would be capable of loving with a penetrating, radiant love. But even while he longed to be loved in so masterful a way, his emotion, which had grown accustomed to great distances, realized how extremely remote God was. There were nights when he thought he would be able to fling himself into space towards God, hours full of disclosure when he felt strong enough to dive back to earth and pull it up with him on the tidal wave of his heart. But, he finds that this doesn't work for him. And then he says, during those years, the great transformations were taking place inside of him. Love works upon a person and modifies them. He almost forgot God in difficult joyousness. He became totally absorbed in mastering what constituted his inner life. He didn't want to admit anything, for he had no doubt that in all this, his love existed and was growing. Now he says, those who have told the story try at this point to remind us of the house as it was then. There, only a short time has passed, a short period of counted time. Everyone in the house knows exactly how much he's coming back home. The dogs have grown old, but they're still alive. All the daily tasks stop. Faces appear in the window, faces that have aged or grown up and touchingly resemble how they used to look. And in one old face grown suddenly pale, recognition breaks through. Recognition? Is it really just recognition? Forgiveness. Forgiveness of what? Love. My God, it is love. He, the one who was recognized, had no longer thought, preoccupied as he was, that love could still exist. It is easy to understand how, of everything that happened then, only this has been handed down to us, his gesture, the incredible gesture which had never been seen before, the gesture of supplication with which he threw himself at their feet, imploring them not to love. Dizzy with fright, they made him stand up, embraced him. They interpreted his outburst in their own way, forgiving him. It must have been an indescribable relief for him that in spite of the desperate clarity of his posture, they all misunderstood him. What he had been bothered by before, those who loved but didn't fully understand him, now are loving again. And the misunderstanding is actually productive. It is expressive of how they feel, how they value him. And it's exactly what he needs. He was probably able to stay. He's giving us the postscript now to the prodigal son. For every day he recognized more clearly that their love, of which they were so vain and to which they secretly encouraged each other, had nothing to do with him. It had to do with themselves. He almost had to smile at their exertions, and it was obvious how little they could have him in mind. How could they know who he was? He was now terribly difficult to love, and he felt that only one would be capable of it, but he was not yet willing. So it ends on a sort of ambiguous note. Beautiful reworking of the story of the prodigal son in this case. And if we want to end here on this, what we can say is that for Rilke, life is extremely rich, calls forth our attention, our openness. If we want to try to make the most of it, that's what we have to do. And that love is similarly ambiguous, mysterious, rich, revelatory of being, revelatory of our existence, but it doesn't clarify all of our problems. It just opens us up to what actually is. It opens us up to a deeper life, but not necessarily a more pleasurable life, not necessarily a life in which all of our questions are answered, but at least one in which all of them can be asked.